Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of precision, you know?
Right. Yeah. Like it's math or something.
Exactly. It's almost like engineering. If you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, "Well, there it is. That's the problem."
Yeah, it's a totally binary state. It's either broken or it's not broken. It's clean. And honestly, I think it's comforting for us. We naturally want things to be visible and, categorized.
Right. We want a clear physical problem that just corresponds to a very clear medical solution.
Totally.
But then you step into the world of end-of-life care. You cross over into medical ethics, the allocation of state resources, and like the fundamental philosophical value of a human life. And suddenly that X-ray machine is completely useless.
Yeah, it doesn't apply at all anymore.
It doesn't. The diagnostic landscape we are looking at today isn't biology anymore. It is economics. It is political science. And it is incredibly, incredibly murky.
Because the exact moment a system starts blurring the lines between healing a patient and eliminating a financial liability, the clarity of traditional medicine just disappears entirely. You are no longer just treating a symptom. You are literally managing a balance sheet.
And that collision, the crash between the balance sheet and the hospital bed, is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive.
It's a heavy one today.
It really is. We have a massive, jarring stack of source material in front of us. We're looking at a highly detailed transcript from a video featuring political commentator Tucker Carlson and Kelsey Sheeran.
And just for some context, Sheeran is a Canadian military veteran, a really vocal advocate, and someone who has spent a lot of time investigating and criticizing state-sponsored euthanasia.
Yes, specifically, she is zeroing in on Canada's Medical Assistance in Dying program, which you'll hear referred to a lot today as MAID, M-A-I-D.
Right. And just to set the stage for you listening right now, we need to be incredibly clear about our role here. The material we are dissecting today touches on some of the most sensitive, politically charged flashpoints imaginable.
Oh, absolutely.
It intersects with these really deep-seated beliefs on both the left and the right regarding bodily autonomy, the power of the state, and, the very definition of compassion.
Yeah, so we are acting strictly as your guides through this specific text.
Yeah.
We aren't here to endorse the claims. We're not validating the politics or condemning the viewpoints presented in this interview.
Exactly. We are entirely neutral here.
Our mission is to just take the architecture of their argument, so the statistics, the historical comparisons, the alleged medical realities, and break down exactly what they're saying and why they are saying it.
Right. We want you to understand the mechanics of this debate regardless of where you personally land on the political spectrum.
So to jump right in, the foundational argument this source makes, the premise that really sets the tone for this whole discussion, is that Western society is undergoing this massive, deliberate reframing of how we conceptualize death.
Yet, the text argues that physician-assisted suicide is no longer being presented as a tragic, heartbreaking last resort for the terminally ill.
Which is how it was originally pitched.
Exactly. But now, it is actively being rebranded and marketed as, quote, healthcare.
And the source points to a very specific moment to illustrate this linguistic shift. It brings up this December 2025 announcement by New York Governor Kathy Hochul.
Right, regarding the push to legalize medical aid in dying in New York State.
Yes, and the language she uses, which the text highlights, is just wild when you actually parse it. She doesn't call it a difficult compromise, She calls it an elegant solution.
An elegant solution.
Elegant solution. And she explicitly tells this story about how the inspiration for this legislation came to her while she was sitting in a Catholic funeral, listening to a priest talk about the deceased being called home to eternal life.
Wow.
Yeah, so she frames the legislation through that specific lens, not as ending a life prematurely, but as facilitating a peaceful, almost spiritual transition.
But the source immediately strips away that spiritual framing and dissects the political theater of it.
Right.
The text argues that the actual problem Governor Hochul's elegant solutions is trying to solve has absolutely nothing to do with existential peace or the afterlife. The actual problem is a fiscal crisis.
The transcript points out that healthcare costs in New York are roughly 37% above the national average.
Which is astronomical.
It is. So the text is making a direct correlation here. You have this massive budget deficit, a state that's drowning in medical expenditures, and suddenly the governor is inspired to offer state-sponsored death as an elegant solution.
Because mathematically, if you look at the data, the final weeks and months of a patient's life are when medical interventions are the most complex, the most frequent, and by far the most expensive.
Yeah, that's where all the money goes.
Exactly. The argument laid out in the source is that keeping people alive is actively draining the public treasury. A population was promised universal or heavily subsidized care, but the bureaucratic systems simply cannot afford to deliver on those promises anymore.
So instead of walking back the promises or, restructuring the bureaucracy, the text claims the state is subtly encouraging citizens to exit the system before they rack up those massive end-of-life invoices.
And they are doing it by branding the exit as a form of liberation.
Yeah, and to really anchor this economic theory, the source pulls up this fascinating artifact. It's a clip from a 2010 Aspen Institute meeting featuring Bill Gates.
Right, and the context here is super important. You have a room full of incredibly wealthy, influential people discussing global resources.
Right.
And in the clip, Gates is talking about the staggering costs of end-of-life medical care. And he poses this hypothetical scenario that basically strips away all the emotion from the issue.
He just makes it pure math.
Pure math. He asks, is it worth spending $1 million to keep a single patient alive for their last 3 months of life? Or would that $1 million be better spent saving the jobs of 10 public school teachers?
It's the ultimate utilitarian math equation, just putting a dying grandmother on one side of a scale and 10 teachers on the other.
And Gates openly acknowledges in the clip that this is exactly the kind of trade-off that critics call a death panel discussion.
He actually uses that term.
Yeah, but he suggests it's just a realistic economic calculation that society eventually has to face.
Wow.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the text is arguing that financial deficits are driving moral redefinition.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because the host in the source material pushes back hard on that exact utilitarian logic.
As they should, yeah.
Because it's a completely forced moral binary.
Yeah.
I mean, why is the choice strictly between keeping a dying patient alive and funding public education?
Right, as if those are the only two line items in the budget.
Exactly. It's like looking at a leaking boat and deciding the best way to save the crew is to just throw the injured passengers overboard, rather than questioning why we're spending billions on luxury upgrades for the captain's cabin.
That's a great analogy.
And the text points out a glaring contradiction in what the state values. It notes that the government eagerly spends billions on complex weapon systems, specifically mentioning things like Patriot missile batteries without a second thought.
Oh, yeah. It's the scarcity mindset applied very selectively.
Precisely. We have limitless abundance for the military-industrial complex. But the absolute second we look at keeping an elderly citizen alive, we suddenly have to pinch pennies and pit their survival against a teacher's salary.
It is a totally manufactured choice. You are creating a false choice to justify cutting the most vulnerable liabilities.
And the text takes that contradiction a step further. It argues this isn't just about balancing a spreadsheet. It frames this as a deeply theological or even philosophical debate about power.
Yeah, the source suggests that there is a bureaucratic class that actually derives a sense of power from controlling the deaths of others. It connects the enthusiasm for massive military spending and foreign wars with this rising enthusiasm for state-sponsored euthanasia.
The text actually invokes the Nazi T4 program here. It brings up the historical concept of the useless eater.
Which is a deliberately heavy, incredibly provocative comparison to make.
Definitely.
But the underlying premise the source is pushing is that human nature has not fundamentally evolved. The temptation for a society to just casually eliminate the people it deems financially or practically useless, that's an ever-present darkness.
But, if that financial and psychological pressure to just eliminate the liabilities is really that strong, how does the medical profession go along with it?
Right, because of the oath.
Yeah. I mean, doctors take an oath to do no harm. How do you legally and morally rewrite the entire foundation of medical ethics to accommodate state-sponsored death?
Well, the source addresses that exact question by looking at the history of the Hippocratic Oath itself. We all know the modern generalized concept of the oath, right? But the text points out a very specific historical shift in the actual language.
What did it used to say?
If you look at the original ancient Greek text, it was completely unambiguous. I'll quote the translation provided in the transcript. Neither will I administer a poison to anybody when asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a course.
Wow. So there's zero wiggle room there. It's a hard, definitive line. Do not give people poison, even if they explicitly beg you for it.
Right. It was designed as an absolute guardrail, precisely because the ancient Greeks understood the inherent power dynamic between a physician and a really vulnerable patient.
That makes total sense.
But the source claims that in the post-World War II era, the modern medical establishment decided that this strict prohibition was too archaic, too restrictive for modern medicine, so they changed the text.
They literally rewrote the guardrail.
They did. They replaced the absolute ban with a highly subjective guideline. The revised version of the oath, which the text quotes, states, "It may also be within my power to take a life. This awesome responsibility must be faced with great humbleness and awareness of my own frailty."
Okay, think about the psychological weight of that single linguistic shift.
It's massive.
The text argues that by changing that oath, the medical profession transitioned from being strictly healers to becoming arbiters of life and death. When you remove the absolute boundary of never administer poison, you are vesting a doctor with what the transcript literally calls a facsimile of godlike power.
And the source asks a really piercing question about human psychology here. Is it actually possible for any human being to retain their humbleness and awareness of their own frailty while they're actively ending another human life?
I mean, I don't know.
The argument is that assuming the power to destroy life inherently corrupts the practitioner.
The transcript goes so far as to compare this modern medical establishment to a priest class in ancient human sacrifice-based religions. It mentions the Aztecs and the Incas.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the text argues that in those societies, the ultimate power of the priest class didn't come from healing the village. It came from their exclusive authority to decide when members of the village were sacrificed.
And to ground this in more recent history, the source ties this ethical shift directly back to the atrocities of the 20th century.
Like the T4 program we mentioned.
Exactly. It brings up the aftermath of World War II and the Nazi T4 euthanasia program, where doctors were actively involved in killing patients, including disabled children in institutional care.
Right.
The text claims that after the horrors were exposed, a shocking number of the physicians involved were never severely punished. Some faced trials, but the source argues the overwhelming majority escaped justice, and some even seamlessly reintegrated into the medical establishment, becoming prominent experts in places like Austria.
So the implication there is that the medical class protects its own. The text is arguing that once a society officially grants doctors the legal power to kill under the banner of compassion, standard oversight just evaporates. The doctors themselves become the ultimate moral authorities, immune to the checks and balances that apply to literally everyone else in society.
So you have this massive ethical shift on paper combined with the crushing economic pressures of modern healthcare we talked about earlier.
But what does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah.
Like on the ground?
Right.
Because if you want to see what happens when those shifting ethics meet a universal state-sponsored healthcare system in real life, the source says you don't have to look at historical hypotheticals.
Oh, you don't?
You just have to look directly north to the United States' largest trading partner, Canada. This is where Kelsey Sheeran's personal investigations as a veteran advocate really anchor the text.
And Sheeran breaks down the reality of Canada's MAID program, Medical Assistance in Dying, which was legalized back in 2016. And the first thing she presents is the sheer staggering volume of the program.
The numbers are insane.
They are. She claims that in roughly a decade, over 100,000 Canadians have been killed by the government under MAID.
100,000 people. In a country with a population of just under 40 million.
Yeah.
That scale makes state-sponsored death a leading cause of mortality in the country. But the text doesn't just rest on the raw number. It digs into the demographics of who is dying. And this is where the host of the video immediately zeroes in.
What did he find?
According to the transcript, over 96% of the people killed by MAID are what the source terms white legacy Canadians.
Okay, let's define that term as the source uses it. They are referring to the descendants of early European settlers, essentially the older, established, culturally dominant demographic.
Right.
The text points out that Canada's overall demographic makeup has shifted rapidly in recent decades, and the country as a whole is only slightly over half white. Yet the euthanasia statistics are overwhelmingly disproportionately skewed toward this specific older white demographic.
And when the host in the video questions why this massive disparity exists, he brings up an answer he allegedly got from querying Google's AI.
Oh, this part is wild.
The AI's cited response was that this disparity exists because white people have, quote, better access to healthcare.
It's just, wow, the source highlights the incredibly dark irony of that bureaucratic logic.
It really is.
The system is classifying being euthanized by the state as a form of healthcare access, and therefore it's attributing the high death rate among this demographic to a twisted form of white privilege.
Right, it's a critique of how algorithmic bureaucratic systems view death simply as a delivered medical service.
Exactly. But how did a program that was supposedly designed for extreme end-of-life suffering reach a body count of 100,000?
Because that was the original pitch, right? Only for people who are already dying.
Right. And to explain that, the source details the legal evolution of the MAID program, specifically the transition from what was known as Track 1 to Track 2.
Okay, break that down for us.
When MAID was initially sold to the Canadian public in 2016, it was strictly Track 1. This legal framework required the patient to have a terminal illness, meaning their natural death was reasonably foreseeable within a short time frame.
It was marketed for the classic scenario, a patient in the agonizing final stages of late-stage bone cancer or ALS, where they only have weeks left and the pain is just unmanageable. That narrow scope is how the government got public acceptance.
Exactly. But the text explains that the guardrails didn't hold. In 2021, the Canadian government introduced Track 2, and Track 2 fundamentally altered the DNA of the program.
How so?
Under Track 2, you no longer had to be dying. Your death did not have to be reasonably foreseeable. You simply had to have a medical condition that was deemed irremediable or grievous.
And who defines irremediable or grievous? I mean, that is an incredibly subjective legal threshold.
And the source argues that this subjective threshold is exactly where the system crossed the line from providing palliative end-of-life relief to actively offering death as a standard treatment option for chronic conditions or physical disabilities.
And the text doesn't just speak in legal hypotheticals here. It leans heavily on Sharon's network as a veteran to provide concrete examples of how Track 2 is applied.
Yeah, these stories are tough.
Very. Sharon brings up the very public, very disturbing case of Christine Gauthier, a Canadian Paralympian and veteran. Gauthier was engaged in a long, frustrating bureaucratic battle with Veterans Affairs to get a wheelchair ramp installed in her home.
Which is just a basic mobility aid.
Right. But after years of fighting the red tape, the text alleges that a VA representative offered her euthanasia equipment instead.
Wait, instead of a ramp?
Instead of a ramp. The underlying message from the state bureaucracy, according to the source, was essentially, we cannot afford or process the paperwork to get you a ramp to live in your house, but we can easily process the paperwork to help you die.
How is that jump legally justifiable? Even under a broad definition of Track 2, offering death for a lack of a ramp is monstrous.
And Sheeran claims it isn't an isolated bureaucratic glitch either. She recounts another veteran calling her with an actual audio recording of a Veterans Affairs case manager actively suggesting MAID as a solution to a veteran who is suffering from PTSD and a traumatic brain injury.
Let's stop and look at that for a second. A psychological and neurological injury sustained in service to the country. It is not terminal. And the state's proposed healthcare solution is to medically terminate the veteran.
What's fascinating here is how the source uses these anecdotes to highlight the absolute paradox of the modern mental health apparatus.
Yeah, the messaging contradiction is huge.
Think about the messaging we see every day. You have massive corporate and government-sponsored campaigns for suicide prevention. The text specifically mentions the Bell Let's Talk initiative in Canada, which is this huge corporate mental health awareness campaign.
Right. Society spends hundreds of millions of dollars telling people, don't do it, your life has inherent value, there is always hope, reach out to the authorities for help.
But then, when those vulnerable people actually do reach out to the authorities for help, state-funded medical representatives are actively suggesting suicide as a viable, legitimate treatment plan.
And the source connects this terrifying reality directly to what it describes as the ongoing collapse of the universal healthcare system in Canada.
Yeah, the transcript paints a very, very grim picture of the current infrastructure there. They talk about emergency rooms with 14 to 18-hour wait times, patients waiting literally years for basic quality-of-life surgeries like knee or hip replacement.
And thousands of people deteriorating or dying while simply sitting on endless waiting lists.
So the core argument Sharon makes is that people aren't choosing MAID because they genuinely want to die. They are choosing what she calls death care because actual restorative health care is completely inaccessible to them.
So if you are a state bureaucracy facing a collapsing infrastructure and an aging population, Track 2 suddenly becomes a very efficient way to clear the waiting lists.
It's incredibly dark. But if this was just a bureaucratic state quietly offering death as a cost-saving measure in windowless administrative offices, that would be one thing.
Right.
But the text points out that this isn't happening in the shadows. State-sponsored death is being actively embraced, romanticized, and advertised by corporate entities and the media as a sophisticated lifestyle choice.
Which brings us to the actual marketing of medical murder and the stark contrast between those advertisements and the brutal physical mechanics of how the procedure is actually performed.
Yeah, we have to talk about the commercial.
The source details a highly produced commercial created by Simon's Department Store, which is a well-known retailer in Canada.
Okay.
The ad featured a young woman named Jennifer Hatch. Hatch suffered from Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a really painful genetic joint disorder. But crucially, the text notes this condition is painful, but it is non-fatal.
Right. And according to the text, Hatch had desperately sought proper health care and specialists to manage her condition. But after failing to receive adequate treatment from the collapsing medical system we just talked about, she was approved for MAID.
Now, you would think a commercial about a young woman choosing to die because she couldn't get joint treatment would be a tragic indictment of the healthcare system.
You would think so, yeah.
But the text points out that the department store ad completely ignored the systemic failure. Instead, it romanticized her decision to die. The commercial featured these sweeping, cinematic shots of beautiful scenery, ocean waves, and bubbles floating on a beach.
Wow.
Yeah, and in the voiceover, Hatch talks about choosing to die not in a sterile hospital, but surrounded by nature, and says, quote, "When I imagine my final days, I see music, I see the ocean, I see cheesecake."
They took state-sponsored euthanasia and packaged it with the aesthetics of a high-end wellness retreat. The text notes how the media brands this process with words like dignity, softness, and bravery.
It is a masterful piece of marketing, but the text immediately pivots from the soft focus imagery of cheesecake and ocean waves to the cold, clinical reality of the procedure itself, because the physical mechanics of MAID are not just falling peacefully asleep like you see in the movies.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we have to talk about the biology here. The source goes into detail, and it is horrifying.
It really is.
The text claims the procedure involves inserting two large 14-gauge 5Es into the patient's arms. The first 5E floods the body with a massive dose of a poison, often an intense anesthetic like propofol, designed to render the patient unconscious and shut down the system.
But the body is biologically wired to fight death. When you flood the system with a lethal dose of a depressant, the heart begins to fail, and fluids quickly back up into the lungs, a condition known as pulmonary edema.
Right. The body's natural autonomic reflex, even if the patient is totally unconscious, is to fight for air.
Exactly. They might gasp, thrash, convulse, or even vocalize as they effectively drown in their own fluids.
And that is why the second 5D is necessary. The text focuses heavily on the second drug administered, which is a paralytic, like rocuronium.
And the source argues that the primary purpose of this paralytic is entirely cosmetic.
Wait, really? Cosmetic?
Yes, it doesn't ease the internal physiological process of the organ shutting down at all. It specifically freezes the skeletal muscles. It stops the patient's body from physically reacting to the poison. Because without the paralytic, the death would look violent and agonizing.
The internal physiological experience taking place, as described by the source, is akin to the sensation of waterboarding or active drowning. But the paralytic traps that experience inside a completely frozen body. The drug ensures that the patient cannot scream or thrash as their lungs fill with fluid.
Think about the massive deception happening there.
Yeah. You're telling me the state is selling an experience that feels like cheesecake and ocean waves, but actually involves medically paralyzing someone so their family doesn't see them drown in their own fluids?
Exactly. And the text introduces the concept of sanctuary trauma here. Imagine the psychological toll on the family members. They are actively encouraged by the state and the medical staff to gather around the bed, hold the patient's hand, and watch this peaceful transition, completely unaware of the violent biological reality occurring just beneath that paralytic calm.
It's chilling. But wait, if the physical reality is this extreme, and the criteria has expanded to include non-terminal conditions, what safeguards are in place to ensure vulnerable people aren't making this decision during a temporary mental health crisis?
Right. You'd assume there are massive safeguards.
Because the source brings up the case of a 26-year-old man named Keanu, and it seems to prove the safeguards are entirely non-existent.
Keanu's story is one of the most damning pieces of evidence presented in the text regarding the lack of oversight. Keanu was 26 years old. He had type 1 diabetes, hearing loss, and seasonal depression. And the text notes the depression was likely linked to multiple traumatic brain injuries he had suffered in past accidents.
So to be completely clear, no terminal illness. He has a very manageable autoimmune disease, a sensory impairment and depression stemming from brain injuries. He's a prime candidate for therapy and endocrinology, not euthanasia.
Yet he is evaluated in his home province of Ontario, and a doctor approves him for MAID.
Are you kidding?
No. However, Keanu's mother discovers his plan. She goes to the media, creates a massive public outcry, and applies enough pressure that the specific doctor in Ontario backs down and cancels the procedure.
Well, thank God. I mean, you would think that in a modern, digitized, state-run medical system, a 26-year-old whose mother is publicly begging to save his life would trigger a massive red flag on his medical file. A system-wide hold.
You would think. But according to the text, the system is completely siloed and shockingly easy to bypass. There was no centralized flag.
What did he do?
Keanu simply engaged in doctor shopping. He flew all the way across the country from Ontario to British Columbia. There, he met with a different physician, identified in the text as Dr. Ellen Weeb.
And she didn't check with his family. She didn't look at the media reports.
Nope. The source claims she approved him and subsequently euthanized him at a local funeral home entirely without his family's knowledge.
A funeral home?
Yes. The text states he paid roughly $500 for the prescription, drove himself to the funeral home, and the doctor met him there to administer the 2 IVs we just described.
How does a 26-year-old with seasonal depression bypass his entire family, fly across the continent, and get euthanized in a funeral home for $500? How does the legal framework of Canada allow that to happen?
The source argues that it happens because the entire concept of safeguards is an illusion. Proponents of the program constantly talk about rigorous oversight committees and strict criteria, but the text claims that the MAID system is effectively self-reporting.
Wait, it's the honor system for state-sponsored death.
Exactly. When a doctor administers the lethal injection, the primary paperwork they submit simply requires them to state, "I was of the opinion the person qualified."
That's it?
That's it. If the doctor writes that the subjective criteria of irremediable or grievous were met, there is no independent external medical board verifying that assessment before the lethal injection is given. The oversight only happens after the patient is dead, based entirely on the notes of the doctor who killed them.
That is terrifying. And to prove how dangerous that lack of external verification is, the text provides another case of alleged coercion involving a woman referred to as Mrs. B.
Right, Mrs. B. This case is heartbreaking. She was an elderly woman suffering from health issues, but crucially, her husband was suffering from severe caregiver fatigue.
Okay.
They went to the hospital, were told by the staff that there was nothing more that could be done to improve her condition, and under that immense pressure, she originally applied for MAID.
But Mrs. B was Catholic, right? And according to the text, as she sat with her deeply held religious beliefs, she changed her mind. She realized she did not want to go through with the euthanasia. She explicitly stated her refusal.
Yet the source claims, referencing an official Ontario coroner's report, that Mrs. B was euthanized the very same day she expressed her refusal.
She said no, and they killed her anyway.
The text uses this case to argue that when you have a subjective, self-reporting system dealing with vulnerable elderly patients, the line between voluntary euthanasia and non-voluntary execution can vanish in an afternoon.
Especially if the patient is perceived as a burden by their exhausted family or by a hospital despot to free up a bed.
Absolutely. And the driving force behind this erosion of consent, the text insists, always comes back to the math. We talked about Bill Gates and Kathy Hochul earlier, but the source points to a specific document in Canada called the Omega Report.
Now, to be clear, the Omega Report is described in the text as an academic university paper, not active government legislation. It was a statistical calculation looking at the financial component of expanding the MAID program.
But the numbers in this academic exercise are staggering. It calculated that an expanded MAID program, one that fully encompasses voluntary, non-voluntary, and specific vulnerable demographic categories, could save the government $1.273 trillion between the years 2027 and 2047.
Let's break down how you even reach a number like $1.2 trillion. You aren't just saving on Band-Aids and Tylenol.
No, not at all.
To generate those kinds of savings, a healthcare system has to eliminate years of round-the-clock nursing care, repeated emergency room visits, specialized memory care units for dementia patients, and incredibly expensive palliative pharmaceuticals.
You are trading millions of dollars in long-term maintenance costs for a single $500 prescription of propofol and rocuronium.
Over $1 trillion in savings by eliminating the patients who require the most care. It is an overwhelming financial incentive for a struggling government.
And the text suggests this isn't just a theoretical exercise, it is the active roadmap.
Yeah, the source unpacks the future expansions currently being debated and implemented in Canada. By March 2027, the text states, mental illness alone, like major depression, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, could be the sole qualifying condition for MAID.
Think about the medical contradiction there. Depression is the very condition that makes a person feel hopeless and suicidal. It distorts reality.
Exactly.
Yet the system is proposing that the symptoms of the disease itself become the qualifying medical criteria for the state to assist in their suicide.
Furthermore, the text claims there are active, ongoing discussions in medical colleges about extending MAID to mature minors. And mature minor is a terrifying legal term because it has no strict age limit, right?
Right. It relies entirely on a single doctor's subjective assessment of whether a child understands the concept of death.
And it goes even younger than that. The source cites a proposal from the College of Physicians in Quebec suggesting the euthanasia of infants children aged 0 to 1 who are born with severe, complex defects like spina bifida or severe brain damage.
And to illustrate how deeply this mentality has already penetrated pediatrics, the source shares a deeply chilling anecdote from Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto.
Oh, this part.
It details a case involving a child with medically complex Down syndrome who required a liver transplant. The mother, fighting for her child's life, felt she was getting the runaround from the staff. According to the text, she secretly audio recorded a conversation with a medical professional where she finally asked, point blank, if her daughter was being denied the transplant because she had Down syndrome.
And the recorded response from the medical professional, as cited in the source, was, I think you know the answer to that.
The implication the source draws is crystal clear here. The system is already making eugenic decisions.
It is already actively deciding which lives are worth the expensive resources of a transplant and which lives due to genetic complexity or disability are too burdensome to bother saving.
But perhaps the most dystopian claim in this entire section revolves around what happens to the physical body after the MAID procedure is complete. The text claims that organs and tissues are actively being harvested from euthanized patients to supply the medical system.
It cites a specific case of a patient on Victoria Island. This was a man who suffered a spinal cord injury. He went to the hospital fully expecting to undergo surgery to repair his legs and begin rehabilitation.
But the system was overwhelmed. Within 10 days of being admitted, instead of getting surgery, he was approved for and received MAID.
And the detail the source focuses on is the conversation with the family afterward. The text claims the doctors explicitly told the grieving family that they couldn't harvest his major organs because he was a heavy drinker, but they were taking his corneas.
They couldn't fix his spine, but they made sure to harvest his eyes.
And it actually gets worse. According to the text, the family reported that the medical staff discussed hooking up his brain waves during the euthanasia procedure.
Why would they do that?
To monitor his pain center as an experiment. They wanted to use his state-sponsored death as a live data-gathering exercise to see how the brain reacts to the lethal injection.
Wow. It just paints a picture of a medical system that has entirely lost its humanity. The source argues the system no longer views the patient as a human being to be healed, but rather as a repository of biological resources to be extracted once their maintenance costs become too high.
Now, if you are living in the United States or anywhere else outside of Canada, it is incredibly easy to listen to all of this and brush it off. You might think, well, that's a uniquely Canadian problem. That's what happens when their specific brand of socialized medicine collapses. It can't happen here.
But the source makes a compelling, really urgent case that this movement is absolutely not geographically contained. It is moving south across the border, and it is moving fast.
Yeah, the text claims the groundwork is already laid in the U.S. Currently, 13 U.S. states and 1 jurisdiction allow what we earlier defined as Track 1 physician-assisted suicide for the terminally ill.
The text does note a mechanical difference in how it's currently practiced in the U.S., though. Unlike Canada's system, where a doctor inserts the IVs and administers the lethal dose, the U.S. model currently requires the patient to self-administer the medication, typically by drinking a lethal liquid formulation.
But Sharon argues that the current state of affairs is just a beachhead. The infrastructure for massive expansion is highly active. She identifies specific organizations driving this push, naming a social engineering and lobbying firm called the Raven Group, which she claims works alongside well-known advocacy groups like Compassion and Choices.
And what is their objective? According to the internal documents and strategies Sharon says she's uncovered, Their stated organized goal is to have 50% of the United States population living in states that allow physician-assisted suicide by the year 2028.
That's incredibly soon.
Right around the corner. And to achieve that, they are incredibly strategic about where they expend their resources. The source alleges they aren't starting with massive, loud federal campaigns in Washington. Instead, they are specifically targeting states with large, older, predominantly white populations, states like Arizona and Florida.
So they are going after the exact demographic that MAID targets in Canada.
Precisely. And the text claims they are using highly localized grassroots efforts. They are going into local churches, hosting seminars in nursing homes, and slow dripping the ideology of death with dignity to the elderly.
Building the base.
Yeah, the strategy is to build a groundswell of support among seniors, so they will eventually pressure their local state representatives to introduce legislation.
So what does this all mean? To really understand the brilliance and the danger of their strategy, you have to look at the linguistic battle they are fighting.
Oh, this part is crucial.
We talked earlier about how the vague term irremediable was the loophole that blew the Canadian system wide open. In the U.S., the lobbying groups are using a different semantic trick. They're trying to entirely rebrand the concept of assisted suicide as end-of-life care.
And that rebranding is not about public relations. It is strictly about unlocking funding.
Ah, right.
The source explains that there are very strict federal laws in place in the U.S., specifically mentioning Clinton-era restrictions like the Assisted Suicide Funding Restriction Act. These laws explicitly prohibit federal tax dollars from being used to promote, support, or administer suicide.
So long as it is called suicide, they can't touch federal money.
Right. It's essentially a corporate rebranding strategy. Think about how food corporations rename high-fructose corn syrup to natural fruit sugars to bypass health regulations and trick consumers.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The lobbying groups are doing the exact same thing with medical terminology. By changing the legal vocabulary from assisted suicide to medical aid in dying or standard end-of-life healthcare, they hope to completely bypass those federal restrictions.
If they successfully convince lawmakers to legally categorize state-sponsored death as standard health care, they suddenly unlock the massive trillion-dollar vaults of federal Medicare and Medicaid funding.
Exactly.
They are trying to change the dictionary so they can open the national treasury.
And the source argues that beneath all of these tactics, beneath the targeted legislation in Arizona, the trillion-dollar budget reports in Canada, the semantic games, and the horrifying statistics of 14-gauge fears, this entire global movement is ultimately rooted in a profound philosophical rot.
This brings us to the deepest layer of the text, the philosophy of pain versus the materialist worldview. The source argues that the push for euthanasia is not a medical advancement at all. It is the ultimate logical manifestation of a purely materialist society.
The text describes modern Western culture as being as shallow as a coffee stain.
That's a brutal line.
It is. It argues that we have built a society that fundamentally believes there is nothing beyond the material world. In this worldview, there is no soul, there is no afterlife, there is no God, and there is no transcendent meaning to the human experience.
And if you truly believe there is absolutely no meaning beyond the physical function of the body, then physical suffering has zero value. It is simply a negative biological stimulus, a glitch in the machine that must be eradicated at all costs.
To illustrate how our relationship with pain has changed, the text compares this modern phobic avoidance of end-of-life suffering to the historical shift in how we view childbirth.
The host in the source notes that there was a period in the mid-20th century, the era of twilight sleep, when women were heavily anesthetized and strapped down during childbirth because the medical establishment viewed all pain as inherently bad and traumatizing.
But eventually, society and medicine pushed back against that. We realized that the pain of bringing life into the world, while intense, had a physiological and emotional purpose. It bonded the mother to the child.
Right. The source argues that previous civilizations, grounded in spiritual traditions, understood that suffering at the end of life also has a profound purpose.
The text suggests that when an elder suffers gracefully, surrounded by their family, they are teaching the next generation a vital lesson about resilience. They are demonstrating how to face the inevitable decline of the body with courage.
And equally important, it allows the family to show true devotion, to serve the person who once served them.
But in a materialist society based entirely on the avoidance of pain and inconvenience, we just throw that lesson away. We don't want to see the suffering, and we certainly don't want to pay for it.
So we drug it, we paralyze it with rocuronium, and we hide it behind a curtain at a funeral home so we can get back to our productive lives.
This raises an important question, though, right from the source text. How do we define human value?
Yeah, that's the core of it all.
The argument is that when a society abandons any spiritual dimension, it inevitably begins to view its citizens merely as economic units. If your value as a human being is tied solely to your productivity and your cost of maintenance, then the exact moment your medical costs exceed your economic output, you become a useless eater.
And when that happens, the very definition of compassion becomes inverted. The source passionately argues that true compassion is pulling up a chair, holding someone's hand through their suffering, and ensuring they are not alone in the dark.
True compassion is not offering to push them off the bridge because their care is putting a strain on the state budget.
The irony is staggering when you look at the broader culture. I want you, listening right now, to view the contradiction the source highlights here.
Think about the society we live in right now.
Yeah, we live in an era that is hyper-focused on safetyism. We put warning labels on hot coffee cups. We mandate mental health awareness in schools. We have massive corporate campaigns and telethons for suicide prevention. We are constantly aggressively told that every single life is precious and that help is always available if you just reach out.
Yet this very same societal structure, the state itself, is simultaneously presenting state-administered death via paralytics and poison as the ultimate sophisticated expression of bodily autonomy and freedom.
It is a profound, terrifying cognitive dissonance.
The source paints a picture of a system that will spend millions of dollars in police and fire resources to stop a teenager from jumping off a bridge on Tuesday, but will actively facilitate the death of a 26-year-old with seasonal depression in a funeral home on Wednesday, provided he fills out the right paperwork, of course, and saves the state the cost of his future therapy.
As we wrap up the analysis of this material, the core takeaways are incredibly heavy, but they are vital for understanding the arguments that are actively shaping public policy across North America right now.
Absolutely. The text paints a highly critical, deeply unsettling picture of a modern healthcare system that is collapsing under its own bureaucratic incompetence and financial weight. A system that has realized it cannot keep its promises and is quietly turning to state-sponsored death as an economic pressure relief valve.
And it is doing so while wearing the mask of empathy, using the language of dignity and elegant solutions to rebrand medical elimination as compassionate healthcare.
The source warns that the proposed safeguards are nothing more than an illusion. The financial incentives to expand the program are too massive for any government to ignore, and the ultimate victims of this calculus will always be the vulnerable.
The elderly, the disabled, the mentally ill, and those who are simply abandoned by a society too busy or too broke to care for them.
So we ask you to take this framework and look at your own local healthcare systems. Look past the marketing. Look at the specific political language being used in your state legislature regarding end-of-life care.
Are they calling it suicide, or are they calling it aid? Look closely at how your community actually cares for its most vulnerable populations when the cameras are off.
Because the source material we unpack today forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question that echoes far beyond the boundaries of this specific interview.
If a society decides collectively that the ultimate, most elegant cure for suffering is simply the elimination of the sufferer, what happens to the bedrock of our social contract?
Think about that. If the government is no longer morally obligated to provide care, to provide comfort, or to provide hope, but is only required to provide a painless, state-funded exit.
At what point does the right to die subtly, quietly morph into a duty to die for anyone who feels they're becoming a burden on their family or the state?
Think back to that X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning.
Yeah. If the diagnostic machine is fundamentally broken and the landscape is obscured by trillion-dollar budget deficits and semantic games, how do you navigate a world where a doctor's final prescription isn't a cure, but an ending?
That's something you really need to ponder.
Think about that.